that's un-American. We don't do that here, right? Get that out of here. Nobody wants to do that, right? Play something that's American. If we'd have been playing it at the same time that the women did and taking it seriously and all that stuff, I have no doubt in my mind that we would be a serious threat on the national stage. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, one step at a time. My name is Corey McKinney. Look, today I'm reacting to a video that has gone viral recently. This is Why the U.S. Sucks at Soccer by the creator Zealand. Obviously, as an American, I'm interested to see what this guy brings to the table and what he has to say, and see if I agree with him or not. Hey, I just want to remind you, a lot of you guys watch the videos that I make. However, you don't subscribe. So I have, 30,000 returning viewers, yet only 5,000 subscribers. So if you would subscribe to the channel. Without further ado, let's jump into the video.
The United States and football don't mix.
Then what are we doing? What's the point?
Hey, I hate soccer.
You do?
Yeah.
I can't stand soccer. I think that it's the least talented sport on earth.
It doesn't care, it does not understand the football culture shared by so much of the rest of the world. And if you've ever wanted to know why, then this video is the one to watch. Because by the end, you will understand football in America and how it has finally started to change. An important part of that fact, though, is that I'm not English. I'm American, actually. I grew up in American football culture, or soccer as we call it. Through years of traveling around the world to make football videos, I have a unique perspective on how the football culture works inside the United States and how it contrasts to the one outside of it. You see, the American sporting infrastructure is constructed differently than basically any other country in the world. Those leagues we spend all the time watching are made up of franchises in closed league systems, and they operate as businesses. The vast majority of those franchises did not start as local sporting clubs or small local entities that eventually naturally expanded into large sporting brands, like Arsenal, for example. It was founded by the workers at the Royal Arsenal complex and eventually, through a long winding tale of events, became a massive sports club. And the lack of that structure in the United States means there's a lack of traditional ties to the community that would be familiar to people that grew up in a football culture. Now, that doesn't mean that...
All right, right off the bat. So one, he threw me off with that accent change, but two, what he's saying is absolutely true. So like this, he's showing the signs of people saying stay in Oakland, all this stuff. Franchises moving cities or being bought by some wealthy investor in another state and moved over is commonplace. It happens all the time, at least in one major franchise. I'd say every other year, or one major sport like hockey, soccer, not soccer, so it's a hockey, football, basketball, something like that. These franchises are just moving, or new teams just get created. And I really hope he's going to get like into draft systems and stuff like that. Everything that he said so far is absolutely 100% correct, because as I see like these communities that are so tied to soccer, right, to their soccer clubs, we have sporting folks that are really into football and stuff like that get really riled up about it, but not like that on a professional level. Now, college level, I would say, is up for debate. I wonder if he's going to cover it. We'll see.
Franchises don't have deep roots in their community. I grew up in Tampa, and I am a huge Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tampa Bay Lightning, and Tampa Bay Rays fan. What I'm talking about here is something like an academy. There's no academy for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to eventually develop some local lads to go on and one day play for their favorite NFL team. This is a result of the way sports developed in the United States. Now, it did develop at the same time as England or France, for example, but it came up around a different social pillar. While football clubs in those countries were found around different factories or town identities in the United States, sports congregated around something that was already all over the place: the local universities and colleges that blanketed the country. Leagues like the NFL or the NBA were actually formed well after college sports was already a huge attraction in America, so they were built on top of the existing infrastructure. That's where the draft comes from, this concept of university players that can no longer play at their university being then drafted into the professional leagues, and it is completely foreign to people that are used to having academies developing their players instead. But it's because those university teams already existed and were hugely popular before the professional leagues ever did. There was one sport that was so old in the United States that it dodged this. That was baseball, which was founded all the way back in the 1840s and developed a local club system similar to football clubs around the world. And as a result, each professional baseball team has a large minor league system that it uses to develop players, which looks a lot more similar to an academy than any other American sport. By 1870, universities were already competing competing against each other in what would become American football, and soccer was not adopted by universities as a sport at the top level until 1959 with the modern rules. Dave Litterer, who maintains the USA Soccer History Archive, said that colleges were playing a hybrid, neither fully soccer nor rugby, but it's only a guess. I don't know, and neither I think does anybody else. Perhaps that is a rather unsatisfying answer in this day and age, but history is not an exact science. Now, he's talking about way back in 1870 when American football and soccer looked a lot more similar than they do now. The truth is, none of those early games played by American universities look like American football, rugby, or soccer the way that those three different sports look today. But eventually the rules of the sport that was played by these university and colleges all over the place were codified and progressed in the direction that would become American football. But what did give the United States...
All right, I'm going to pause him. So I'm glad that he's talking about all of this. As you guys know, I am really into American football, specifically college football. I believe it to be the best sport on the planet, and then soccer is a close second. And so him getting into the system of like how it became what it is professionally, how a draft system was instilled and or installed and all that, and then also talking about just the roots of where the American football sport came from and how it developed, where we got the name football, how it began to branch apart from things like soccer and rugby, and how really the early games didn't look that much different. That's all really good stuff. One, for me to just have a history recap, but also for you guys to kind of get an understanding of where I'm coming from when I talk about the sport that I love the most. And so this is a really, really cool deep dive. So far, 100% on everything. He's doing such a good job breaking this down.
Its continued exposure to the developing rules of soccer was immigration. 25 million Europeans came over to the United States from 1830 to 1930, including 8 million people from the British Isles. As a result, particularly in immigrant communities, the modern rules of soccer were played in a lot of local leagues and clubs. And it was actually out of this crop of players that the United States selected its first World Cup roster for the 1930 World Cup, the first one ever. This team, quite amazingly, managed to reach the World Cup semifinal by beating Belgium and Paraguay before getting smacked by Argentina 6-1, who would go on to lose to eventual champions Uruguay. The tiebreaker from the group stage actually gave the United States a third-place finish, which is still the best finish by any team ever from outside of Europe or South America. And the striker on that team, Bert Patenaude from Fall River, Massachusetts, actually made history. He scored the first ever World Cup hat trick against Paraguay. When the players returned back to the United States, there was no cohesive place for them to play. The size of the United States prevented a national league from developing, and the university preference for American football meant that these players could only practice at local clubs and various leagues that would pop up and then go away as soon as they seemed to appear. And as
Yes, yes, he's doing such a good job. Okay, so coming out of that, like learning more about soccer and how this all came about, we come from that World Cup. One, I didn't know that we finished third in that. That's really a big deal. I did not know that that's what we found. I knew we participated in the first cup. I did not know that it came down to us being in third. That's really awesome. But he's talking about the size of the U.S. A lot of people don't understand just how big the United States is. For example, there was this post I saw on Twitter a couple months back, and this dude was talking about, he's talking to some of his relatives that are from Europe who have never been to the United States, and he was like, hey, what do y'all want to do when you're here? And they're like, well, we figured we'd visit, he lives in New York. They're like, we figured we'd, visit New York, then we'd drive down to Miami, Florida, and then probably go over to Los Angeles, California, and just kind of see some sights. And he was like, you guys have no idea just how big this country is. You don't just drive to those in a day. Those are hours and hours and hours of flying and stuff like that. So like the massive size of the U.S., trying to develop something that doesn't have a lot of support as is into a major sport, and really get the ball churning on developing that and making that something way greater than what it is, was just not possible at the time. It didn't have the support. So I'm glad that he's getting into this.
As a result, after a triumphant performance at the 1930 World Cup, the United States would only play in 4 more World Cup matches until 1990. As other footballing cultures around the world were developing league systems and professionalizing their players to train at a higher level, the United States strategy of just slapping together a team of immigrant or second-generation players from local leagues to go play the World Cup just wasn't working nearly as well. There was also this underlying factor, this driving motivation to assimilate into U.S. culture. The rules for association football football were viewed as foreign. After all, the United States had its own rules, and it had its own sports. The United States is almost entirely an immigrant nation. Even in the annals of my own personal family history, there are stories of great-grandparents that didn't teach their kids their native language from where they came from because of fear of those kids being ostracized. They wanted them to be able to completely assimilate into society, and speaking another language wouldn't help them do that. Which is ironic, because now it would be really helpful, but here I am trying to use Rosetta Stone to be able to get back where we started. And with all those cultural and infrastructural factors working against it and no cohesive plan to try and save association football, it just became something that nobody cared about. It is worth mentioning, though, that the United States did beat England at the 1950 World Cup in England's first ever World Cup appearance in Brazil. It's considered one of the greatest upsets in World Cup history, with the US coach saying before the game that his team were sheep ready to be slaughtered, which is not a motivation tactic I'm familiar with. While England's team was obviously full of professional players, everybody on the US team had jobs on the side and was still playing at those small clubs and local leagues. It is absolutely hilarious how unorganized it was compared to today. I mean, the US captain was picked specifically for that game. It was some dude named Ed McIlvaney, who had been born in Scotland, and the reason they gave for picking him as the captain in that match was, well, he was British. The guy actually went on to play for Manchester United, by the way. They called him the Yank from the tail of the bank. And maybe, just maybe, with the idea of the internet and instant communication, this sort of miracle story would have spurned an interest in association football in the United States, the plucky underdogs upsetting favorites England. But none of that existed. In fact, only one American reporter was in Brazil at all, and it's because he decided that he should cover it on his own. He paid for his own trip to Brazil to cover the tournament. It was clear that the United States had settled into association football as a second-tier sport. And for 40 years, it stayed that way. The US existed entirely outside of the footballing world. It played Super Bowls while the rest of the world was playing World Cups. But there was actually one very surprising silver lining that saved football in the United States, and that was university sports, actually.
Okay, so he's about to get into university sports. This whole background of all this is so good, because he is detailing exactly what I think the problem is with the U.S. and why I think we're still struggling to come to grips with soccer. One, we don't understand how big this sport is, and I say we as from like a general American perspective. When I began making videos with YouTube with Luke on YouTube, a year ago or so, I remember saying things like, well, it's not that big of a deal, or like the sport can't be that great or anything like that. And I remember even commenting on some players and being like, yeah, but who cares, and even saying, well, you can't measure that greatness because, we don't really know. But what I didn't understand is that literally every other country virtually on planet Earth cares about soccer, and the U.S. Americans do not. Like, we just don't. And he's really getting into the fabric of why. However, I think that it's changing, right? I think that we are getting to a point where we are coming around to the sport. I know with guys like me, 2 years ago, I was laughing, like the one dude at the beginning of the video was like, "We think soccer's stupid. We don't care about that." That was me. I did not care. I made fun of it. I thought it was a silly sport. They just run around and don't score any goals. That's what I thought it was. Now I love it. It's my second favorite sport, on the planet, and so I think that Americans are coming around to it. But you guys have to understand that framework when y'all's great grandparents and even parents ahead of them were gathering together to kick a soccer ball around and stuff. We were throwing baseballs and footballs. It wasn't like this. And so, something that's so rooted and ingrained in the majority of you guys who watch my videos, something that's so rooted and ingrained in y'all's culture is not so much for us. And so it's really, I think that's why, one, it's taken so much longer to get to this point, but two, why I think it's going to take just a little bit longer for us to get on board with it. But he's about to dive into the university side of things, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say.
And first, this was actually on the women's side of the game, thanks to a law colloquially called Title IX. This was a law regarding scholarships for American university and college sports teams. Scholarships being a free ticket to go to school, which can be quite expensive in the United States, in exchange for being a very good athlete playing on one of the sports teams. Well, Title IX said that each college and university had to give out the same number of men's and women's scholarships for sports every year, and it was enacted all the way back in 1972. too. The problem for schools immediately was all the scholarships given out on the American football teams, because that's a sport that's only been played by men at the university level. So there was no women's team full of scholarship American football players to balance it out. This led a ton of universities and colleges to jump into creating women's soccer teams, because the teams were pretty large and the facilities were relatively cheap, so you could get a lot of scholarships to help balance out your scholarship inequity. The result was a very large apparatus of identifying and developing talented women's soccer players before really any other country in the world. And by the time the first Women's World Cup was created in 1991, the United States had created a machine, despite being a non-factor on the men's side that had just qualified for its first World Cup in 50 years. The United States women won the entire tournament. By 1999, the women's national team had become superstars because the United States was good at it. They won the World Cup in a sold-out Rose Bowl in California. Over 1.1 million people attended that 1999 Women's World Cup. The United States was clearly ready to embrace soccer for the first time as long as the team was winning. After all, the United States is a sucker for a spectacle. And it was through star power that the men's side of things got its first jolt, its first false start, when Pele signed for the New York Cosmos.
Okay, so this is good. Title IX, I'm actually, spoiler alert, I'm hopefully working on finishing up a video on Title IX right now and why the U.S. Women's team is so good. Because I wanted to know, why are they so good and so iconic, and why are the men not? And he's doing a really good job explaining that. Title IX, which a lot of people do not know about and do not understand, who are outside of the U.S., do not know how that works. He did a really good job explaining it. We have the scholarship system. And as many that are handed out to the guys have to be handed out for the girls. And most of the time, too, in most situations, if you want to have a new men's team, right, you have to have a women's sport to come alongside of it in that Title IX process. And so soccer became huge for women on that front. And so which started to open up the door to some American hearts. But he said a key phrase there, right? He said that Americans were interested as long as America was winning, right? As long as we were winning. If we're sending teams out to lose, then we stopped caring about it so much. That's why it was such a big deal when the U.S. women's team started to win again recently, is because it started to churn that up just a little bit, right, and get everybody excited again. But we tend to only care about national teams when we're winning, right? You look at basketball. You can ask any American how much they care about the U.S. men's national basketball team when we play in the Olympics and stuff like that. Nobody gives a crap until we win, right? If we lose, everybody's like, whatever, we suck. But if we win, we're like, yeah, that's my team, go America, blah, blah, blah. If you give us any chance to play England and we win, bro, that's just cause for pouring more tea into the ocean. So anyway, so I say all that to say, it's good that he's getting into this and breaking all this down. I really hope, guys, I already knew the majority of this. I really hope that this is helping you guys out as well. Let's keep going.
In 1975, and him and a couple of other famous footballers from days gone by were selling out American football stadiums because people wanted to watch them play. The star-studded NASL was the United States' first serious attempt at a top-level outdoor professional league, but once the star power departed, the NASL quickly folded back into nothingness. All the while, the grassroots development of American men's players was not kicking on at all. In fact, because of the American football scholarship disparity in Title IX, there are a lot less men's university teams than there are women's university teams. By the time the NASL failed, the American FA knew that it had to do something else, so it launched a wild bid for the 1986 World Cup. And while that bid failed, the United States eventually won the bid for the 1994 Men's World Cup, despite having never qualified for a World Cup past 1950. Wow. And it was at that moment, once again, surprisingly, that university sports came to the aid of American football. Well, not American football, but American Association football. I was bound to mess that up eventually. After all, after the NASL disappeared, there was no professional outdoor league. The high amateur level of university soccer on the men's side, as limited as it might be, was the highest level you could play outdoors in the country. The U.S. coach Bob Gansler picked a team of players fresh out of college to try and make it to the 1990 World Cup in preparation for 94, and those players were given small contracts by the American FA so they could train professionally in preparation. Gansler said of his team, team, many of them were second-generation immigrants. Their parents and family lives different from an apple pie American ideal. They loved a sport that many around them reviled.
Wow.
That last bit we will come back to later, don't worry. But the qualification for 1990 was huge, because there were rumors that if the United States couldn't make a decent showing at the 1990 World Cup, that the 94 World Cup might actually be pulled. And it all came down to a final qualifying match at, get this, Trinidad and Tobago, which hadn't lost at home in 2 years at that point. The National Stadium in Porto, Spain was packed, and the United States managed to deliver what was perhaps its most important win ever on the men's side. A stunning strike from Paul Caligiuri gave the Americans a 1-0 win.
Putting it in to Caligiuri. Beats the first man. A left-footed shot!
So cool, man.
Paul Caligiuri has scored a goal, and the USA lead 1-0.
The United States arrived at the 1990 World Cup, its first in 50 years, with a thud, a 5-1 loss against Czechoslovakia. And the next match was against the hosts, Italy, and that match was projected to get wildly out of hand. I mean, why wouldn't it? The United States was essentially a college all-star team with 1 or 2 professionals thrown in for spice and flair against a team that had Baresi, Maldini, Baggio. But in a gutsy performance, the United States only lost 1-0. It was a result so surprising that the host nation fans actually booed their star-studded team off the field. It was also a performance that opened doors for Americans in European leagues in a serious way for the first time, with 10 players from that team in 1990 going on to sign contracts to play professionally in Europe. That included John Harkes, the first ever American to play in the Premier League, and recognizable names like Casey Keller. This produced a much more competitive team at the 1994 World Cup for the United States, where it pulled off a shocking upset of Colombia to actually make it to the knockout stages in its home World Cup. And that home World Cup coincided with the founding of MLS, which was the first sustainable professional outdoor league in the United States in 1994. Although that wasn't clear immediately, because MLS was a bit fledgling in its early years, but was able to build itself up by convincing owners to buy into the league instead of individual teams. But it also was designed to appeal to an American public.
He says something good there too, convincing the owners to buy into the league and not just individual teams. Whereas in the in other sports, that's not typically how it works, right? You buy into, like for American football, for example, or American basketball, the league could fall apart, but your franchise, like as long as there's other franchises willing to play each other, then for the most part, you don't necessarily need the league, right? But in soccer, you need that, right? You need that. That's part of the game. That's part of what gives it that element of play, is like this idea that there are other that this whole league of teams has come together, and it's not just a business that can be sold. This is what's so big about soccer, is that I think that the U.S., the Americans, we're going to try and make it as much of a business as possible, try to hit that same business model that we have with, American football and basketball and all that. But the thing is, I don't think it'll ever truly be that, because that's just not the way that it's designed to be. And so I'm glad that he made that distinction there.
Closed leagues. I made an entire video about MLS. I'll link you to it at the end of this video, but the point is, eventually it developed into a very profitable league structure that could also produce and develop professional players in a way the United States has never been able to do before. But it's still not developing players the same way a club in a normal footballing culture would, because of university sports. University men's soccer went from a help to get the national team off the ground to a hindrance, often forcing young players to choose between multi-year commitments to play at a university or just going pro out of high school at 17 or 18 years of age. Not to mention the serious issues caused by a lack of football academies in the United States, because MLS, which is a closed system, is only going to have 30 teams in it, which means everybody else has to pay for play in the youth systems that they want to participate in. For example, the travel team I grew up playing in ended at U18 because after that everybody just got a job or went to college. There was no senior club attached to it that was playing in like the 4th tier of anything. That doesn't exist. But there was, and still is, a more significant cultural inertia for football to overcome in America. And this brings me back to that comment that the U.S. coach made when he was building his 1990 squad, talking about how the sport was reviled. Now, there are no facts here, no quantifiable way to discuss this, but the coach captured a long-held distaste that many Americans felt for soccer when he used the word reviled. Because of how sports and society developed in the United States, as we just talked about, soccer was a foreign sport. It was played by the other. It was un-American. And so the more American you became as an immigrant, the less you played it. And as a result, it became excluded from the American.
Yes. Okay. So he's about to get into precisely. Yes. Oh man, this is so exciting. he's gonna kind of bash us just a little bit, but he needs to kind of get to the point that he's making. With this, I will say that that what he's getting into is like this idea of nationalism, right? But we do it pretty interestingly here. I don't think that there's anything wrong with nationalism to a degree. I think you should be proud of the area that you're from, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. However, in the American culture, especially like in the 50s and the 60s and all that, when we really got that strong national identity, it was so much of us versus the world, and that's really how a lot of Americans viewed everything, especially when it came to this sport, soccer. And so when you have, this organized sport that is being played around the world, and these immigrants are coming in and wanting to play and all this stuff, that's un-American. We don't do that here, right? Get that out of here. Nobody wants to do that, right? Play something that's American. Hey, why don't you speak English while you're at it? Nobody wants to talk this other language. And so you can see really quickly how that kind of falls apart right at the fabric there. So it's really good that he's mentioning this. It's good that he's about to get into this because I really do think this is what hindered America for so long in the sport. If we'd have been playing it at the same time that the women did and taking it seriously and all that stuff, I have no doubt in my mind that we would be a serious threat on the national stage, and the MLS would be something incredible, right? But it just hasn't been that, and likely won't be that for still even a long time. But I think we are making progress. But let's see what he has to say.
National ideal. When playing American football, for example, and let's say you weren't playing tough enough to the coach's liking, it wouldn't be out of place to hear the coach say something like, "Come on, this isn't soccer, stop flopping around." In the United States, we like to think of ourselves as very tough. And American football in particular embodies this. It's a brutally tough sport, and soccer was soft by comparison. This is hard to explain as an American, but we essentially have an inferiority and superiority complex at the same time. We lack the historical precedent and cultural development of many other countries around the world. We know we are rougher around the edges, and as a result, we treat the perceived refinement of these other cultures as a weakness. And that weakness was reflected in the less physical sport that they all played, soccer. And soccer is still now reviled by a portion of the American population for, lack of a better word, not being a manly enough sport. But that perception is changing through my generation and the generation before me. First, it was Dempsey and Donovan, then the generation of Pulisic, Adams, and McKinney. We grew up watching the Premier League on TV on Saturday mornings, playing FIFA online with our friends, and learning about the world of football through a screen. And we want that here. Or in the case of our new generation of players, we want to be part of it. A deep cultural understanding of the rules doesn't exist yet, but recognition of the sport has increased infinitely from that hard-scrabble group of trailblazers back in 1990. To watch the World Cup knockout match against the Netherlands in 2022, I had to wait outside a bar for 2 hours at 6 a.m. just to get inside and watch the game. The 2015 Women's World Cup final was watched by 27 million Americans. That's 10 million more Americans than English people that watched the English women's team win the European Championship in 2022. In a Washington Post poll after the 2022 World Cup, 8% of Americans said that soccer was their favorite sport, just a few percentage points behind baseball and basketball. And among Americans under 30, soccer had passed baseball in that same poll. So yes, we sucked for a long time, but the reasons why are changing. And even though football in the United States will always look and feel different because of the way it was formed, American football, American association football, will never be lost in the darkness again.
So let's, by all means, hey, he did a great job. He did such a good job. He literally hit the nail on the head on every single aspect of what's going on. And I like how he really solidified that the generation in front of us and my generation, and really the generation that's behind us too, these younger kids that are teenagers and even younger than that, Messi coming over was huge. All right. There's this term bandwagon in the US, and I'm sure it's everywhere else too. Matter of fact, I got called a bandwagon Newcastle fan, so I know that that's everywhere else as well with you guys. But there's this idea that, like, when somebody really begins liking a team or liking a player in any sport here that they previously did not like or did not care anything for, we call them a bandwagon. Well, let me tell you, when Messi came over, everybody was a Messi fan. Everybody, people who didn't even care about soccer anymore, immediately gravitated towards the fact that Messi was here, and it shined a spotlight on MLS in particular, so the American League, but also soccer as a sport in the nation of the U.S. And so it's a big deal big deal that all this is going on. And so I'd like to say, man, this is such a good video. I'm very excited that he broke it down the way that he did, because for all of you that have watched this just on your own and all that, you kind of have a better understanding, I would hope anyway, of how the U.S. functions and operates when it comes to different sports, and also why soccer has not been, so great for us. And it's also comforting to remember, we're not good at soccer, not because we, like, for whatever reason, don't develop the same way or something like that as literally every other country on the planet physically, but it's just because we haven't cared about it. And like the minute we start caring about it and start taking it seriously, I'll be able to, likely with my children, watch the U.S. men's team performing on the national stage and doing really well, because that's another good thing about the U.S. and something that I think that he missed just a little bit is just how much money we're willing to pour into sports, especially when we know that we can be good at it. Like if you were to tell Americans today, like take American football for example, if you were to tell Americans today that, hey, there's another league that has developed in Europe and they are claiming that they are better at American football than we are, you better believe people would be pouring into stadiums in droves to make sure that we are able to amplify the name on national level. If it meant that we had to fly teams out to Europe and play these other teams and stuff, we would 100% do it, and we would foot the bill for that just to prove that we're better, right? So when it comes to the money that's going to go into the sport, you better believe we got it. You better believe that we'll develop the players that we need to. We just have to get to that final point of taking it that seriously. So I'm really excited to see and like how this club idea works out, how really training leagues and stuff like that work out. If it's ever going to vary outside of college, like if there going to be a U20 league in America that's actually taken seriously, or is it still going to happen at the collegiate level? I don't know. We're going to find out. But I will tell you one thing. I am truly excited for the future of soccer in the U.S. So, hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you stuck around to this point, man, if you don't subscribe, what's wrong with you? This is like 30 minutes long already. You might as well do it. Don't forget, I have other videos on the channel, and I would love to interact with you on that. Make sure you comment, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, share, do all the things. Until the next video, I'll see you then.